The October frost came early to Dunmore Creek that year, settling over the valley like a judgment nobody had asked for. Anneliese Hartman stood at the edge of the train platform with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter she'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. And she tried to remember why she'd thought this was a good idea. She'd answered the advertisement in late August, when the boarding house in Winnipeg had given her 2 weeks' notice, and the dress shop where she'd worked for 3 years had closed without warning or severance. The advertisement had been plain, almost insultingly so. Rancher in Alberta seeks capable woman, honest, willing to work, must be comfortable with children in rough conditions. No mention of romance. No promises beyond room, board, and fair wages. She'd written back the same afternoon because she had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go. And a man named Broderick Holt had written back within the week with a train ticket and instructions that were equally plain. She wasn't a bride, exactly. That distinction mattered to her in ways she couldn't fully explain. She was hired help with the understanding that something more might develop if both parties agreed it should. That was how Broderick Holt had phrased it in his second letter, careful and cautious as a man checking ice before he stepped on it. She'd appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated flattery. What she had not anticipated was arriving to find the platform empty except for a child. The boy was perhaps 7, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large and boots that had seen better winters. He stood with his hands in his pockets and studied her with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who'd learned early not to expect much from strangers. "You're the woman from the letter," he said. "Not a question." "I am, Anneliese Hartman." She crouched to his level, which made her carpetbag scrape the platform boards. "And you're?" "Theodore." He said it like it was a burden he'd been issued at birth. "Pa calls me Theo. Most people don't call me anything. Where's your father, Theo?" "Fence came down on the north pasture. He said to tell you he's sorry, and that I know the way home." She looked at this 7-year-old boy who'd been sent to collect a grown woman from a train station like she was a parcel, and she thought about the letter with its soft folds and its careful wording, and she made a decision that she would not, under any circumstances, cry at the Dunmore Creek platform in front of this child. "Well then," she said, picking up her bag, "lead the way." The wagon ride took 40 minutes along a road that might generously be called a track. Theo drove with the focused competence of a boy who'd been doing it longer than was probably wise, and Anneliese sat beside him and asked questions about the ranch that he answered in as few words as possible. She learned that there were 30 head of cattle, down from 60 before the bad summer. She learned that the hired man, a person called Wicks, had left in September without explanation. She learned that Theo's sister was 8 and had broken her wrist climbing the barn rafters and was currently furious about it. She did not learn much about Broderick Holt, except that he worked constantly and ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint. "Is he a good father?" she asked, because she thought she should know. Theo considered this with genuine seriousness. "He doesn't leave," the boy said finally. It was not the ringing endorsement she might have hoped for, but it was something. The Holt Ranch sat at the base of a long slope, the kind of land that would have been beautiful in summer, and was currently a study in gray and rust and the particular brown of grass that had given up. The house itself was solid. She could see that from the road, a 2-story structure built to last by someone who'd understood Alberta winters. But the barn needed paint, and the fence on the east side leaned at an angle that suggested it had been leaning for some time, and nobody had gotten around to straightening it. Broderick Holt was waiting on the porch when they arrived. He was taller than she'd imagined from the letters, lean in the way that came from never stopping rather than from not eating, with dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that were visibly calloused even from a distance. He came down the porch steps as she climbed out of the wagon, and he looked at her the way she'd looked at the ranch from the road, assessing damage, calculating what could be fixed and what couldn't. "Miss Hartman," he said, "I apologize for not meeting the train." Your son explained. "Is the fence repaired?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, mostly, then no harm done. She extended her hand and he shook it, brief and businesslike. His grip was careful in a way that suggested he didn't always remember to be. "Shall I see the house?" The inside was clean in a utilitarian way that told her immediately that someone was working hard to maintain basic order, but hadn't the time or inclination for anything beyond basic. Floors swept but not washed. Dishes clean but stacked without particular care. The smell of coffee and wood smoke and livestock that had tracked in on someone's boots. She noted these things without judgment. She'd grown up in a household that ran on one woman's labor, and she knew what was possible and what wasn't. The daughter, whose name was Margaret, and who wore her splinted wrist like a badge of honor, appeared at the top of the stairs and stared down at Anneliese with open suspicion. Are you going to try to be our mother? She demanded. No, Anneliese said immediately. I'm going to try to be useful. Those are different things. Margaret descended 2 stairs, which Anneliese took as cautious progress. Can you bake? Competently. Can you? Pa burns everything. I don't burn things. We'll manage. Margaret descended the rest of the stairs. The first weeks were harder than Anneliese had admitted to herself they'd be. The house had its own logic, accumulated from years of a family living in it, and learning that logic took time she didn't have because there was always something else to be done. The stove ran hot on the right side and cool on the left. The well pump needed to be coaxed in cold weather. There was a system for the root cellar involving a specific order of storage that Theo explained with the gravity of someone imparting classified information. Broderick worked from before light to after dark and appeared at meals as a presence rather than a participant, eating efficiently, and sometimes forgetting to speak for stretches so long that Anneliese began filling the silence herself just to make sure the children remembered conversation was a thing that happened. She'd been there 3 weeks when she found the account ledgers. She hadn't been looking. She'd been searching for a candle stub in the desk drawer and instead found a neat stack of notebooks filled with Broderick's careful handwriting. She shouldn't have read them, and she read them anyway, because numbers told truths that people didn't always volunteer. What she found was not quite as bad as she'd feared, and considerably worse than she'd hoped. The ranch was solvent by a margin that depended on the cattle market staying stable, the winter not being brutal, and nothing going wrong that cost money to fix. All 3 of those conditions were, in Alberta in November, more wish than plan. She set the ledgers back carefully and thought about what she'd learned. She thought about it for 2 days before she said anything, choosing her moment when the children were in bed, and Broderick was at the table with his coffee, and the particular stillness of a man who'd stopped moving for the first time since dawn. I found your account books, she said. He looked at her across the table. His expression didn't change. And I spent 3 years keeping books for Madame Leclerc's dress shop in Winnipeg. She had 4 locations and a supplier in Montreal, and I managed the accounts for all of them until she closed. Anneliese wrapped her hands around her own cup. I can see where you're losing money that you don't need to lose, if you want me to look properly. A long silence. Outside, wind tested the windows with the preliminary curiosity of a winter that had decided it was ready to begin. You'd tell me the truth, he said. Not quite a question. I wouldn't have mentioned it otherwise. He looked at his coffee. All right, he said. It was not, she would later think, a particularly dramatic moment. But it was the first time Broderick Holt had accepted help from anyone in what she would eventually learn had been a very long time. And she understood somehow that it mattered. The man who complicated everything arrived on a Thursday in December, driving a sleigh that was considerably nicer than anything in the county, and wearing the kind of coat that was designed to signal that its owner didn't need to worry about the cost of coat. His name was Aldous Crane, and he was the kind of man who introduced himself with his full name and waited for you to recognize it. Anneliese did not recognize it. She was on the porch, splitting kindling when he arrived, and she watched him climb out of his sleigh and assess the ranch with the same evaluating look she'd used, but without any of the corresponding willingness to find something worthwhile. The Holt property, he said to her, making it sound like a conclusion he hadn't decided yet. Mr. Holt is in the barn, she said. I'll let him know you're here. She did not hurry. She told Broderick, who came out of the barn with the unhurried pace of a man who knew exactly who was waiting, and had decided not to let that knowledge affect his steps. She learned the rest later in pieces. From Broderick that evening, who explained in the flat tone he used when something bothered him, and he'd decided not to let it. And from Theo the following morning, who had clearly been listening from somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Aldous Crane owned the bank that held the mortgage on the Holt Ranch. He also owned 3 other properties in the valley and had arrived with what Anneliese considered stunning timing to discuss the terms of the outstanding loan. The terms he proposed were not the original terms. They were new terms, adjusted for what he described as changed market conditions, and what any person with working arithmetic could see was a restructuring designed to make the loan impossible to satisfy on the original timeline. The amount wasn't ruinous by itself, but it required paying down a significant portion of principal by spring, which Broderick did not have, and which would require selling cattle at winter prices, which were not good prices, which Crane certainly knew. What did you tell him, she asked that evening, that I'd think on it? Broderick was looking at the window the way he looked at the account ledgers, like a problem he hadn't yet found the right angle to approach. How long do you have? He said the end of February, the bank's being generous. His voice carried no warmth toward Crane's generosity. Anneliese thought about the numbers she'd spent the past 3 weeks learning. She thought about the cattle prices and the outstanding debts, and the amount in the account books that could be moved without breaking anything critical. "There's something he wants," she said. "Beyond the money. Men like that don't drive out personally in December to discuss terms they could send by post." Broderick looked at her. "What does he want that's on this property?" she asked. A pause. "The water rights. This land sits above the main aquifer for the Eastern Valley. Whoever controls the Holt water rights controls water access for 6 other ranches, and if you default on the loan, he acquires the property, with the rights. So the point isn't the money at all." Broderick was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said, "I don't think it ever was." She had not grown up in comfort. She had grown up in a 2-room house in rural Manitoba, with a father who repaired harnesses for a living, and a mother who made ends meet through a combination of skill, stubbornness, and the refusal to acknowledge that the ends were not quite meeting. She understood what it was to work at something that could be taken by someone with more power and fewer scruples, and she understood the particular helplessness of watching it happen in slow motion while the law stood by and called it business. But she also understood accounts, and she'd spent 3 weeks learning this one in particular. She started with what she knew. The problem was the timeline. If Broderick could make the payment in time, Crane had no legal grounds to take the property. The cattle would sell at a loss, but winter wouldn't last forever. There were also the supply contracts she'd found in the ledgers, 2 that had lapsed when the hired man left, that she thought could be renegotiated if someone had the time to write the letters. "I can write the letters," she said. "It's not your problem," Broderick said. "I'm aware. I'm making it mine," she said it quietly, without drama. "You took me in when I had nowhere to go, and you've paid me fairly, and you didn't make it strange when I needed it not to be strange. This is me being useful. Let me." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one he wore when he'd expected something and gotten something different instead. "All right," he said, the same word he'd said about the account books. She wrote 6 letters in 3 days, working at the table after the children were in bed, drafting and revising with the lamp turned up as high as it would go. She wrote to the 2 suppliers about renegotiated contracts. She wrote to a cattle buyer in Edmonton she'd found referenced in the ledgers with a note that the previous communication had been unanswered, which she suspected meant Broderick had sent 1 letter and not followed up. She wrote to a solicitor in Calgary, whose name she'd gotten from Margaret Patterson, the postmistress in Dunmore Creek, who knew everything about everyone, and had, after Anneliese's 3rd visit to collect mail, decided that she was worth talking to. She wrote a careful, specific letter to the Alberta Land Registry requesting documentation of the original water rights agreement, because she wanted to see the actual legal language before she assumed anything about what Crane could and could not do. The response from the solicitor came back in 10 days. His name was Franklin Adair, and he wrote in the dry, precise style of a man who'd spent 30 years saying exactly what he meant and nothing else. What he said was that the original mortgage terms were what they were, that Crane had the legal right to adjust them within the bounds of the contract, but that the water rights themselves were a separate instrument and subject to different conditions, and that depending on how they'd been registered, there might be questions worth asking. He also said, in a final paragraph that read like an afterthought but wasn't, that he'd known Jacob Holt, Broderick's father, and that the family had always paid their debts, and that if there was something to be done, he'd like to help do it. She showed Broderick the letter that evening. He read it twice. She watched something in his face loosen slightly, the way ice loosened in early March before it actually broke, the suggestion of movement before movement arrived. "He knew my father," he said. "He said so. My father died thinking this place would be taken. He'd mortgaged it badly and couldn't see the way out." Broderick set the letter down. "I've been trying to fix what he broke for 8 years. That's a long time to carry someone else's mistake." "It's not his mistake I'm carrying." His voice was flat. "It's the fact that he didn't trust me enough to ask for help when he should have." She understood then, more about why he'd looked at her offer to examine the books the way he had. Why I'd think on it had been offered to Crane. Why the hired man leaving hadn't been replaced immediately when the ranch clearly needed the hands. He was trying to solve a problem that kept expanding by working harder and longer, which was not the same thing as solving it, but was at least something he could control. She'd done the same thing for 3 years in Winnipeg, working extra hours, because the dress shop's finances were unstable, and if she just worked harder, covered more, managed more, perhaps it would be enough. It hadn't been enough. The shop had closed anyway. She didn't say this to Broderick. Some things were clearer seen than said. What she said was, "Write back to Adair. Tell him you want to ask the questions." He wrote the letter himself. She noticed but didn't comment on it. Aldous Crane returned in January, which Anneliese had been expecting, because men who wanted something didn't wait patiently once they'd set a clock running. He came on a day when Broderick was in Dunmore Creek for supplies, which Anneliese suspected was not an accident. Crane's timing was too consistent to be coincidental. She met him at the door. He looked at her with the particular assessment of a man who'd decided she was a domestic variable and was recalibrating. "I'm here to speak with Holt," he said. "He's away. I can take a message." Crane stepped up onto the porch without being invited. He was not a large man, but he moved like one, the way some men moved who'd learned that taking up space was a form of authority. "You're the hired woman," he said. "I work here, yes. You've been here, what, 2 months? 3? He glanced past her into the hallway. "You've gotten comfortable. I've gotten useful," she said. "There's a difference." His gaze came back to her, sharper. "Holt can't make the payment. We both know that. The sensible thing, for everyone involved, is to make a clean arrangement before February." "The sensible thing," Anneliese said, "is to wait until Mr. Holt is present before discussing his business. I'm giving you the chance to be helpful." A word in the right ear at the right moment. His voice had gone smooth in a way she recognized. The register men used when they thought they were being charming. "This doesn't have to be unpleasant for anyone. Meaning if I encourage Broderick to accept your terms, you'll be grateful in some way you're implying without specifying." The smoothness slipped a fraction. He hadn't expected the directness. "I'd remember it," he said. "I'll remember this conversation instead." She held the door. "I'll let Mr. Holt know you called. Good day, Mr. Crane." He left. But he left slowly, the way men left when they wanted you to feel them leaving, when they wanted the departure itself to carry a message. She stood in the hallway for a moment after the sleigh sounds faded, letting her hands unclench. Theo appeared at the top of the stairs. "Was that Crane?" "It was. He came when Pa was away last time too, I know." She looked up at him. "Did you hear any of that?" A small pause that meant yes. "Some? Good. Remember it." She turned toward the kitchen. "Come help me with dinner." She told Broderick that evening, all of it, exactly as it had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to most things. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant he was deciding something. "He offered you something," Broderick said. "He implied something without committing to it." "Yes, and you sent him away." "I work here," she said. "Not for him." Another silence, different from the first. "Miss Hartman," he started. "Anneliese," she said. "It's been 3 months. You can use my name." He looked at her. Anneliese. Her name in his mouth sounded careful, the way his letters had been careful, the way he was careful with most things he didn't want to damage. "Thank you. You don't have to thank me for not betraying you." "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." The letter from Franklin Adair arrived the 3rd week of January and changed everything. He had found something in the original water rights registration, a clause that had been included in the instrument by Broderick's grandfather, and that had been, Adair suspected, overlooked when the mortgage was drawn up. The water rights were registered separately from the land title and could not be transferred as part of a mortgage default without a specific additional instrument that had never been signed, which meant that even if Crane acquired the property through default, the water rights would remain with the Holt family and could not be absorbed into his holdings. Crane's plan, in other words, depended on a legal assumption that wasn't legally sound. Adair wrote carefully about what this did and didn't mean. It didn't make the debt go away. It didn't prevent foreclosure if the payment couldn't be made. But it removed the prize that had made Crane willing to work at taking the property. And without that prize, the question became whether he'd find it worth the effort and the cost to pursue. Broderick read the letter twice at the table, Anneliese sitting across from him. When he finished the second reading, he put it down and looked at her. "You found this," he said. "Adair found it. I just asked the right questions. The right questions are most of the work." He rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his version of visible relief. "I need to tell him we can't make the February payment, but we can make it by May if the spring market holds. If Crane knows the water rights can't transfer, he may decide the property isn't worth the legal cost of pursuing. And if he decides it is, then we still have Adair and we have the water rights issue on our side. And we fight it in the courts where at least the rules apply, which is better than where you were in December. Much better than where I was in December." She had not expected, when she'd boarded the train in Winnipeg with a soft folded letter and one carpet bag, to find herself caring about the outcome. She'd expected to work, to be useful, to survive the winter and see what the spring brought. Somewhere between the account ledgers and the solicitor's letters, and 3 months of dinners, and the look on Theo's face when he'd driven her from the train station like she was worth collecting, she had developed opinions about the outcome. She had developed opinions about Broderick Holt more specifically, which was a more complicated thing to sit with. She was practical enough to recognize what had happened, and practical enough to understand it didn't simplify anything. She'd come here as hired help. The arrangement had terms. What she felt about the man who ate dinner at the same table as her every evening, who thanked her for things he didn't have to thank her for, who had told her about his father and the 8 years of carrying in the flat tone he used when something had cost him considerably. That was a separate thing from the arrangement, and she kept it separate. Margit did not help with this. Margit had, somewhere around Christmas, decided that Anneliese was satisfactory, and had expressed this by becoming a persistent and deeply inconvenient observer of every interaction between Anneliese and her father. She asked questions with the cheerful investigative ruthlessness of a child who decided she wanted a specific outcome and was prepared to gather evidence in support of it. "Do you like it here?" Margit asked one afternoon while they were baking. "I do," Anneliese said, which was true. "Better than Winnipeg? Different from Winnipeg? Do you like Pa?" "He's a good employer." Margit made a face that communicated exactly what she thought of this answer. "I mean, do you like him?" "I think," Anneliese said carefully, that's a question you should let settle on its own. Those things take time. You've been here 4 months. That's not very long. It's long enough for Pa to laugh more than he did before." Anneliese looked at her. "Does he? He laughed at dinner last week when Theo spilled the milk, and you said, well, at least it's not the soup because there are limits to what one evening can demand of a person." Margit met her eyes with complete seriousness. "He doesn't usually laugh." Before, she hadn't noticed. She thought about that, about what it meant to be living closely enough to someone that you stopped tracking their laughter. "Roll that dough more evenly on the right side," she said. "You're getting thick spots." Margit rolled the dough, but she looked satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with pastry. Aldous Crane came back at the end of January with a solicitor of his own, a soft-faced man named Hughes who carried a briefcase, and the expression of someone who was paid not to have opinions. Broderick met them in the yard this time. Anneliese watched from the kitchen window without pretending she wasn't watching. She couldn't hear the conversation from where she stood. She could read it in posture and gesture well enough. Crane's early ease giving way to something tighter. Broderick's stillness, which was not the stillness of a man uncertain, but the stillness of a man who'd prepared and was waiting. Hughes opening his briefcase at some point and then closing it again without extracting anything useful. The conversation ending in a way that looked like a door shutting. Crane drove away without the slow departure this time. Broderick came inside, removed his coat and hat, and sat at the table. She put coffee in front of him without being asked. "He knows about the water rights clause," Broderick said. "What did he say? That he'd need to review it with his solicitor? That his terms stand pending that review?" The corner of his mouth moved. "He doesn't want a legal fight he might not win over a property that won't deliver what he wanted from it. He'll look for another way to get the water access, which means he'll spend his energy somewhere else. So the ranch is safe, for now." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Spring market will take care of the rest. Adair thinks we can negotiate an extension given the water rights situation, that Crane won't push too hard on the timeline when he doesn't have the leverage he thought he had. So it's over." He looked at her across the table. The Crane part of it, the way he said it left the other parts of it unspecified, and hanging in the kitchen air with the coffee steam and the smell of the bread she'd put in the oven. "Anneliese," he said, and stopped. "Yes, when spring comes." He stopped again, which was frustrating because he was usually economical with words rather than struggling with them. "Your arrangement here was through winter. That was what was agreed. It was. I'd like to change the arrangement." He looked at his coffee. "If you'd consider it." "What kind of change?" "A permanent one." He looked up. His eyes were steady, and she thought about Theo saying he doesn't leave as the most complete endorsement he knew how to give. "Not because it's convenient, not because you've been useful, though you have been. Because I'd like you to stay, and I think, if I'm reading things correctly, that you might want to." She had been practical her whole life, practical in Manitoba and practical in Winnipeg and practical on the train to Dunmore Creek with a soft folded letter in her hand. Practical was how she'd survived most things, and it had served her well. But practical and honest were different things, and she'd promised herself honesty when she'd written back to that plain advertisement in August. "You're reading things correctly," she said. He exhaled, the way people exhaled when they'd been holding their breath without meaning to. "All right," he said, and it was the same word again, the word he used when he was accepting something he hadn't been sure he'd be allowed. She thought about Margit's satisfied face over the pastry dough. She thought about Theo, and his 2 sizes too large coat, and the way he'd driven that wagon with the concentration of someone taking a duty seriously. She thought about the account ledgers and Franklin Adair's careful letters, and 8 years of a man carrying something alone because he hadn't been able to ask for help. There are conditions, she said. He looked at her. Name them. I keep the books, not because you're incapable, but because I'm better at it, and there's no reason for both of us to do it when one of us has more time and more practice. Agreed, I make decisions about the house. Not all decisions, but the ones in my area I make without consulting you, and you don't second-guess them after. Agreed. And when something is wrong, we say so. No carrying things alone until they're too heavy. You tell me when there's a problem before it becomes the kind of problem that requires me to find it in a ledger drawer. He was quiet for a moment. That one's harder. I know. I'm asking anyway. He looked at her with the expression she knew now, the one for when something was different from expected. Agreed, he said. Outside, the wind had eased. February was still coming, and the payment and the spring market and whatever Crane decided to do next. There were 30 cattle and a leaning fence, and a barn that needed paint, and a solicitor in Calgary who'd known Broderick's father and had decided the family was worth helping. There were 2 children who would have opinions about everything, and a ranch that needed work it had always needed. There was also this, a table, 2 people, a cup of coffee gone slightly cold, and a word that meant the same thing every time he said it. The spring market held. Adair negotiated the extension without difficulty, Crane having apparently decided, as Broderick had predicted, that the water rights dispute made the property a poor prize compared to the legal cost of winning it. He turned his attention north, toward other land, other leverage, and the Holt Ranch settled back into itself without the particular weight of a man wanting something he wasn't owed. Anneliese wrote the letters to Franklin Adair after the payment cleared, thanking him properly, and he wrote back in his dry, precise way, saying that it had been straightforward work, and that Jacob Holt would have been relieved to know the place was in good hands. She framed that letter, which Broderick found slightly embarrassing, and which she left framed anyway, because it was her house now, and she got to decide. Theo's coat was replaced before the next winter, fitted properly this time, and he wore it with the self-consciousness of a boy who'd been told he looked respectable, and wasn't sure how he felt about it. Margit's wrist healed, and she climbed the barn rafters again within a month, which was not a surprise to anyone. Anneliese watched her from below with her heart in her throat and said nothing because Margit was 8 years old, and had already demonstrated that she did not accept conditions on her movements, and there were battles worth choosing, and battles worth leaving alone. She married Broderick in May, in the Dunmore Creek Church, in the presence of about 40 people, most of whom she'd met through the post office conversations with Margaret Patterson, who attended and wept cheerfully, and told everyone afterward that she'd known from the 3rd letter that it would work out. The dress was one she'd made herself, practical for the season, the best fabric she'd been able to find in Edmonton when she'd gone with Broderick in April for supplies, and he'd suggested, without much elaboration, that she might want to look at the fabric bolts while they were there. She'd looked. She'd found what she needed. That was generally how things went. There were still difficult seasons after that. A late frost the following spring that took the early crops. A dispute with a neighboring property about a boundary line that required Franklin Adair's careful attention again. Years when the cattle market dropped and years when it rose, and the steady ordinary difficulty of keeping something alive that could always, with the wrong combination of circumstances, stop being alive. But the ledgers were kept well, and the letters were written, and the problems were said out loud at the kitchen table before they became the kind that lived in drawer-bottom notebooks and grew in the dark. Theo grew into a young man who had his father's stillness and considerably more words, which he deployed with the patience of someone who'd learned that speaking carefully mattered more than speaking often. Margit grew into a woman who climbed whatever she decided to climb, and had inherited enough of her father's stubbornness and her stepmother's practicality to formidable in ways that were largely to the good. Anneliese kept the account books, and she kept the letters from Adair, and she kept the soft-folded advertisement that had brought her to the Dunmore Creek platform in October, with one carpet bag and nowhere else to go. She kept it because it reminded her that the plainest things could open into something worth having. No promises, no flattery, just the offer of honest work in difficult conditions, and the willingness of 2 careful people to say yes to something they weren't entirely sure of, and to mean it, and to keep meaning it through the leaning fences and the hard winters, and the ordinary impossible daily work of building something that held.